In 1898, the small Missouri town of Millstone was erased from every map. No records, no descendants, no graves. Just a single line in an archived newspaper that read, "The Vancroft women have returned to the river." For more than a century, locals whispered that two sisters, Esther and Ruth Vancroft, committed a sin so horrifying that the earth itself refused to hold their remains. Tonight, we'll open the doors they sealed shut, because beneath the water, their story still breathes. And if you listen closely enough, you might just hear them humming. Have you ever walked into a place so still you could feel the dead listening? In the far corner of Missouri's Ozark Mountains stands what's left of Vancroft Hollow, a hamlet erased from every county record after 1899. Only one ruin remains, the stone foundation of a farmhouse locals call the Preacher's House. Every October, smoke is seen curling up from that hollow, even though the valley's been empty for a century. No one goes there after dusk, not since the fire. The story begins with Reverend Elias Vancroft, a traveling holiness preacher who came to the Ozarks in 1891 with his 3 daughters, Margaret, Lillian, and June. His wife had died on the road west, and folks said he never buried her properly. He preached hellfire by day and dug deep pits by night, saying he was burying temptation. By the spring of 1898, his sermons changed. He spoke of cleansing the bloodline, of burning out what festers beneath the skin. His congregation dwindled to nothing but his daughters, and a few frightened neighbors who claimed the Reverend's eyes turned black when the wind shifted. Then came the summer drought, and the screams no one dared to answer. County sheriff records recovered from an 1899 flood show the first complaint, July 2nd. Persistent smell of carrion from the Vancroft property. Witnesses report chanting after midnight. Family refuses visitors. 2 weeks later, the hollow went silent. When a storm finally broke the drought, lightning struck the Vancroft house. It didn't burn down. It exploded, scattering timbers 100 yards. In the ashes, deputies found no bodies. Only charred floorboards that had been burned from beneath, and symbols cut into the joists, rings, triangles, a spiral that looked alive when rainwater filled it. Among the debris lay a half-melted photograph plate, the Reverend standing beside his daughters, all 4 holding hands. Behind them in the blurred background, something else, taller than a man, head bent low to fit the frame. After that night, cattle in nearby farms were born without eyes. The church bell rang by itself at 3 a.m. 3 nights in a row, though the steeple had been empty for years. A surviving witness, old Thomas Byers, wrote in his 1901 diary, "I saw them girls walking through the mist white as milk, each carrying a coal bucket. Heard them whispering to their daddy under the dirt. Said he was still preaching, down where the fire don't go out." Today, if you stand on the cracked stone foundation at dusk, the soil still smells of ash and iron. Locals say if you press your ear to the ground, you can hear breathing, slow and patient, waiting for someone to finish the sermon. And every once in a while, a traveler vanishes along the ridge road. Search parties find the same thing, footprints circling in the mud, small and barefoot, leading back toward the hollow. They said the Vancroft daughters didn't die in the fire. They just changed. By autumn of 1898, strange reports began filtering into neighboring towns. Stories of pale women seen near Ash Creek Bridge, barefoot in the frost, faces hidden by shawls. The county coroner called them wandering specters, but the few who claimed to meet them swore they were flesh and blood. One hunter, Samuel Greaves, stumbled into a clearing near the old Vancroft land and found 3 small fires burning in a triangle. In the center, a circle of coal dust and feathers. He said he saw figures kneeling, whispering over the coals. When he called out, the flames rose by themselves, and something cold brushed his shoulder. He dropped his rifle and ran all the way to town. When the sheriff's men followed his trail the next morning, they found his rifle half melted, the wood fused with iron. A week later, Deputy Marshal Willard Crow received a telegram from the state capitol. Investigate persistent disturbances at abandoned Vancroft property. Locals report possible mass hallucination or criminal cult activity. Crow rode out with 2 men, Deputy Hardin and a photographer named Corwin, who'd been hired to document whatever they found. They reached the hollow by sundown. The air felt wrong. Still, heavy, like it didn't want to move. The ash soil glittered in their lamplight as though filled with crushed bone. The house itself was nothing but a scorched skeleton, beams black and bowed. Yet when Crow stepped inside, the floor creaked under him like a heartbeat. They explored the remains room by room, burned furniture, melted tinware, and what looked like hundreds of dead birds, all arranged in spirals across the floor. Then, Corwin found the trap door. It was half buried in soot, secured with a rusted chain. The boards were carved with the same spiral sigil seen in the sheriff's report. Hardin hesitated. Crow pried the chain loose. When they pulled the door open, a gust of air came out, warm and damp, like something breathing underground. They descended a short ladder into blackness. The cellar was perfectly intact, untouched by the fire. Jars lined the walls, filled with what looked like river mud, and above each jar a hand-carved name: Margaret, Lillian, June. Corwin lifted his flash powder to take a picture. Just before it went off, they heard it. A faint scratching sound beneath the dirt floor. Then a voice. A man's voice, muffled, reciting scripture backward. The flash exploded, lighting the cellar in a white flare. And in that single moment, Crow swore he saw something pressed against the earthen wall. A face. Eyes open, mouth moving. When the smoke cleared, the wall was just dirt again. But Corwin's glass plate, the only one he managed to take, captured a faint image. A handprint rising from the soil, 5 fingers stretched wide, and another hand gripping it from below. They sealed the cellar that night and rode back at dawn, silent all the way to Ash Creek. But by the next morning, Crow was dead. Found in his hotel room, throat blackened as though burned from the inside. Hardin never spoke again. Corwin vanished en route to the capital. His camera was found in a pawn shop 2 years later, still containing the cracked plate. Locals began to whisper that the Vancroft Sisters were still there, bound to the house by whatever sermon their father had started. They were said to walk the creek at night, singing hymns with no words, their faces hidden by wet veils. No one dares to dig in that hollow anymore, because the fire, they say, still burns under the floorboards. And if you stay too long, you can hear the sound of a man preaching from below, his voice deep, echoing through the mud. The fire purifies all blood. In the winter of 1898, a sound began to roll through the valleys of the Missouri Ozarks, soft at first, like wind through reeds, then swelling until every cabin window shook in its frame. It came just after sundown. No instruments, no melody, only voices, hundreds of them rising from the same direction, the hollow where the Vancroft house had stood. Farmers said the air shimmered when it passed. Lantern flames leaned sideways. Dogs crawled under porches and refused to come out. No one could explain it, but in every nearby church the congregation found their hymnals open to the same page. Psalm chapter 141. Let my prayer be set forth before thee as incense. That was when Jonathan Reeves arrived. He was a young reporter from St. Louis, 26, chasing the same sort of stories his editor called rural hysteria. Reeves thought he'd make his name debunking superstition. He carried a camera, a notebook, and a Colt .38 he swore he'd never need. His first night in the town of Willow Gap, he stayed at the boarding house above the telegraph office. The keeper, Mrs. Edders, brought him stew and whispered, "If you hear the singing, don't answer it." He laughed it off, until midnight when the walls began to tremble and he heard the faint sound of women's voices humming just outside his window. When he looked out, there was nothing. Only the road curling down toward Vancroft Hollow, glimmering faintly as if wet with ash. The next morning, Reeves rode out to the ruins. Snow lay heavy on the ground, but around the foundation the earth steamed, thawed from below. He found burnt hymn pages frozen into the mud. Each one bore a different line written over and over in pencil. He will speak through us when the breath returns. Inside the cellar, someone had pried the boards open again. The spiral symbol was freshly cut into the wood, deeper this time, bleeding sap like the boards themselves were alive. Reeves set his camera on the step, struck a match, and saw something moving in the far corner. A figure crouched low, rocking slowly. When his match went out, the rocking stopped. He waited. Then, from the darkness, a soft, childlike voice said, "Are you come to listen?" He ran. That night, in the telegraph office, Reeves wired his editor. Strange phenomena verified. Sound recorded on cylinder. Possible gas leak OR underground venting. But the operator never sent it. The wire went dead halfway through transmission, and when the repair crew opened the line a week later, they found the copper burnt black for nearly half a mile, as if lightning had struck it repeatedly underground. 3 days later, the choir grew louder. Witnesses from as far as 10 miles away described hearing, quote, "a congregation beneath the soil." Cattle refused to cross streams. Birds left the valley entirely. One miner from Ash Creek claimed he saw fire seeping from cracks in the ground, like veins under skin. Reeves returned to the ruins one final time. In his journal, later found beside a scorched camera tripod, he wrote, "There is a rhythm in it. The voices breathe together, drawing air from the earth. I think I understand now. It isn't a song. It's the sound of something waking up." That was the last entry. 2 nights later, a tremor rolled through the valley, and the ground at Vancroft Hollow collapsed inward, swallowing the remains of the house entirely. The snow turned gray for miles. No one ever found Reeves. Only his wax cylinder survived, half melted, the grooves etched with a sound that still hasn't been explained. 1,000 voices exhaling at once, followed by one low word whispered in Latin: memoria, memory. Spring 1899 brought a single stranger to Willow Gap, Reverend Caleb Hollis, newly assigned by the state synod to re-establish worship among the scattered people of the hollow. He was 29, clean-shaven, and stubbornly unafraid of superstition. In his letters home he wrote, "These folks mistake echoes for devils. Faith will cure the sound." He reopened the charred church on Ash Creek Road. The roof leaked, the bell hung crooked. He set up a small organ and held service every Sunday whether anyone came or not. Usually, only 3 or 4 farmers sat in the pews, staring at the floorboards. The first sermon ended with a tremor so faint it rattled only the hymn stand. By the 3rd week, plaster began to drift from the ceiling in tiny gray flakes whenever he said the name Vancroft. Hollis called it coincidence. On April 3rd, he decided to bless the hollow itself. He walked down before dawn with a Bible, a lantern, and a flask of oil. The air smelled like wet copper. He read Psalm chapter 23 aloud, and for a moment the wind stilled. Then something whispered his own words back to him, but wrong. Each line echoed a heartbeat late, distorted, as if spoken through water. When he reached, "I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever," the echo answered. "We still dwell." The lantern burst, spraying oil across his sleeve. He stumbled backward, stamping out flame, and saw orange light flicker under the soil itself, thin cracks glowing, pulsing like veins. He fled. That night the choir returned, louder than before. The people of Willow Gap woke to see the sky glowing faint red above the valley. The sound rolled through the fields like waves. Doors shook on hinges. Every clock stopped at the same moment, 2:17 a.m. When daylight came, the church bell tolled once, though the rope was cut. Hollis gathered his congregation at noon, pale but resolute. He spoke for 40 minutes about redemption, about how evil only survives where faith refuses to speak its name. But halfway through, his voice faltered. He stared upward, eyes fixed on the rafters, listening. Then he smiled in a way no one had seen before and began reciting a sermon that wasn't in his Bible. Old phrases, strange cadences, ash to flame, flame to breath, breath to word. The farmers ran. The bell tolled again by itself. 3 days later, searchers found Hollis kneeling on the foundation of the Vancroft house, hands clasped, mouth open as though mid-prayer. He was stone still, eyes white. His skin had turned the color of ash. When they tried to lift him, his body collapsed into dust. In the soil beneath where he'd knelt were 3 handprints pressed into the clay, small, delicate, unmistakably feminine. After that, the county sealed the hollow for good. The last official record reads simply, "Property condemned by order of the state." Ground unstable, but people still hear it. Every few decades, on a spring night heavy with thunder, the faint tolling of a crooked bell drifts across the Ozarks, followed by the same whisper that ended Reverend Hollis's final letter. The sermon goes on. 120 years after the fire, the hollow was nothing more than a name on yellowed survey maps. Then, in 2018, the Missouri Historical Preservation Society received a crate of glass negatives found in an estate sale outside Jefferson City. Inside were landscapes, portraits, and one unmarked envelope wrapped in oiled cloth. Written on the back, in faint graphite, Corwin, 1898. Archivist Emily Harcourt was the first to open it. She had no idea that every person who'd handled Corwin's equipment had vanished within a year of touching those plates. She only knew she'd found something extraordinary. She set up the negatives in the restoration lab at dusk. The first few slides showed ordinary frontier scenes, church socials, farmsteads, children posing stiffly before a painted backdrop. Then came the 11th plate. At first glance, it was a blur, a collapsed farmhouse, a spiral carved in the soil. When she adjusted the light balance, the shape resolved into 3 women standing shoulder to shoulder, heads bowed. Their eyes were smeared shadows, but each seemed to be looking straight at her through the glass. Behind them, faint as breath on fogged glass, was the outline of a man, taller than the women, head bent low, one hand extended as though pressing against the inside of the picture. Emily logged the discovery at 7:43 p.m. Her note read, "Possible double exposure. We'll analyze under UV." At 8:10 p.m., the security camera caught the restoration room lights flickering. She was seen leaning close to the plate. Then she straightened, startled, and turned towards something behind her. The feed froze for 4 seconds. When it resumed, she was gone. The glass negative lay cracked in 2 on the table, edges blackened as if scorched from the center outward. 3 days later, a colleague reviewed the digital scan Emily had uploaded before she vanished. In the corner of the image, written in reverse across the emulsion, were words that hadn't been visible before. "Remember the sermon." The file metadata showed it had been modified at 2:17 a.m., the same time every clock had stopped in 1899. News of the missing archivist made local papers. Reporters called it a tragic accident during chemical processing. But the night the story ran, every phone in the preservation office rang at once. When the staff answered, all they heard was faint singing, like a women's choir humming through static. By morning, the lines were dead. A maintenance worker later found Emily's security badge half buried in the dirt beside the shipping dock. It was warm to the touch. Pressed into the metal was a single fingerprint that wasn't hers, smaller, more delicate, like a child's. After Emily Harcourt's disappearance, her brother Daniel, a freelance documentarian, refused to accept the official explanation. He had one surviving file from her laptop, a GPS coordinate in the middle of the Appalachian foothills, near an unmarked patch of woodland labeled simply, Private Property Corwin Tract. Locals said that land had been bought and sold a dozen times since 1900, yet no owner ever set foot there twice. Hunters avoided it. Satellite images showed faint geometric patterns in the clearing, like something buried beneath the soil kept shifting over the decades. Daniel convinced two friends, sound engineer Liam Torres and folklorist Dr. Melissa Kent, to join him. They packed thermal cameras, drones, and a radiation counter, joking about ghost hunters on a hillbilly expedition. By the third day, no one was joking anymore. The first night, they reached the old fire road just before sunset. The trees leaned inward as if the forest itself were listening. Their drone feed flickered the moment they crossed the boundary, interference that made the image stutter into black and white frames like an ancient newsreel. In the distance stood the remains of a stone foundation, all that was left of Corwin's rectory. The ground around it was strangely warm. Geiger readings spiked, but not from radiation. It pulsed in waves, almost like a heartbeat. Liam, holding the parabolic mic, frowned. He was picking up whisper frequencies, women's voices layered over one another, repeating something rhythmically. When they slowed the playback later, the words became clear. The sermon is not finished. The cellar still sings. The cellar mouth. Under the foundation, half choked with roots, was a collapsed stairwell. The air that seeped out was sweet and rotten at once, like lilac blossoms laid on graves. Daniel's flashlight caught movement. For a moment he thought he saw a human handprint in the dust, small, feminine. But when he blinked, it was gone. They descended anyway. The cellar walls were blackened brick, the mortar pulsing faintly with condensation. On the far side was a wooden door still standing upright, though there was no frame to support it. It wasn't attached to anything, just hovering an inch off the floor, a relic left behind when everything else burned. Carved into the wood were three initials, M-A-L-A-S-A. The Ozarks Sisters. Melissa traced them with her gloved finger, whispering, "Maybe Corwin locked them down here." Then something knocked back from the other side of the door. 3 slow knocks, measured, like an answer. The night spiral. They fled to the surface and camped 50 yards away. But around midnight, Daniel woke to find the ground beneath the tent shifting. When he stepped outside, his feet sank into soft earth. A perfect spiral had formed around their campsite, the same shape seen in the old photograph. At the center of that spiral was Emily's broken ID badge. It hadn't been there before. Daniel screamed her name, and for one long breath the forest answered in her voice. Not from any single direction, but from the soil itself. "Daniel, I see them." They never stopped listening. Then silence. By dawn, Melissa was missing. Her sleeping bag was neatly zipped. Her recorder still ran, the last 12 seconds filled with static, and then a voice identical to Emily's whispering. She believed. That's why they took her. Liam refused to go back for her. Daniel, trembling, turned the camera on himself and said, "If anyone finds this, remember the sermon." The earth groaned. It didn't sound like a tremor or a shift of roots. It sounded alive. The spiral that Matthew had uncovered inside the cellar wasn't just carved. It moved, pulsing faintly, like a heartbeat pressed beneath layers of soil. For a long moment, no one dared to breathe. Only the faint flicker of their lantern cast trembling shadows over the walls, shadows that seemed to move independently of the light. The air felt thick, charged like the pressure before a storm. And then came a sound, faint, whispering, almost like a voice echoing from the walls themselves. Turn the circle back. Sarah stepped closer, the static hum of her recorder buzzing in her hand. "What did that?" she whispered. But she stopped mid-sentence. Her eyes were fixed on the spiral. It was bleeding. Thin lines of dark fluid, not quite blood, not quite oil, seeped from the grooves, crawling down toward the floor. Matthew stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a rusted pail. "Jesus, Sarah, what the hell is that?" She didn't answer. She just stared, transfixed, as the spiral's pattern shifted, rotating slowly against the direction it had been carved. And from the hollow beneath the cellar floor, something sighed. A cold wind spilled upward through the cracks, carrying with it the stench of rot, burnt herbs, and something faintly metallic. The cellar door behind them slammed shut. The echo rolled through the walls, like thunder trapped underground. For a few long seconds there was silence. Then Sarah's recorder picked up a burst of static. Beneath it, a voice whispered through, warped, stretched, but unmistakable. "You shouldn't have come back." They bolted for the door, but it wouldn't open. The wood had swollen, or maybe something held it from the other side. Sarah's flashlight flickered, casting brief, horrifying glimpses across the walls. Names were scratched into the stone: Eleanor, Grace, Lila, the Vancroft Sisters. And below them, freshly etched letters that hadn't been there a moment ago. Sarah Vancroft. She froze. Her own name, but she wasn't related to the Vancrofts. At least, she didn't think so. Matthew swung the pickaxe against the door. Once, twice, again. But the wood didn't splinter. The sound it made was wrong. Hollow, like striking bone. He turned to say something to Sarah, but she was gone. Only the recorder remained, still running, static pulsing like a heartbeat. Then came a whisper through the device. "Downstairs, she's waiting." He turned toward the spiral again. It wasn't a carving anymore. It was a hole, perfectly circular, black, endless. Matthew leaned forward, unable to help himself. The pull was magnetic. The closer he got, the louder the heartbeat became. No longer in his ears, but inside his head. And then, something moved in the darkness below. Pale fingers, slick with that same black fluid, clawing at the edges of the spiral. A woman's face began to emerge, featureless at first, then forming slowly, impossibly. Her eyes opened. Gray. Empty. And when her mouth parted, Matthew recognized her. Sarah, but her voice wasn't hers anymore. It was layered 3 tones at once, the sisters speaking together through her. The blood remembers, even when the flesh forgets. The floorboards splintered under Matthew's feet. He fell, screaming. But there was no impact, only darkness swallowing him whole. In the silence that followed, the spiral closed, and the cellar door creaked open, as if nothing had ever happened. A week later, the sheriff found the house abandoned. Matthew's truck was still outside, keys in the ignition. The only thing left inside was Sarah's recorder, lying at the top of the cellar steps. When he pressed play, there was only one sound: breathing. Slow. And then, faintly, a woman's voice. "We're still here." The spiral glowed faintly in the dark, pulsing in rhythm with that breath. March 1898, Missouri Ozarks. The night was damp, swollen with fog that coiled around the trees like smoke from a dying fire. Inside the Vancroft chapel, candles bled wax across warped wood, each flame swaying to the rhythm of the storm outside. 12 people stood in a circle, hands clasped, eyes closed. Their lips moved in unison, whispering something too old to belong to any language spoken in the Ozarks. At the center of that circle stood Reverend Elijah Vancroft, a tall man, sharp-featured, his black coat stiff with sweat and dirt. In his right hand he held a Bible, though its pages had long been replaced by scraps of leather, bone, and something that looked disturbingly like human skin. He spoke, low, deliberate, his voice trembling with something that was not fear but devotion. The flesh returns to dust, but the spirit must be kept alive. Even if it must feed. The congregation swayed, heads nodding like puppets. At the back of the room, 3 young girls watched: Eleanor, Grace, and Lila. The Vancroft Sisters. Their eyes were glassy, faces pale under the candlelight. Grace held a small jar, filled with black, thick liquid. Eleanor clutched a lock of hair tied with red string. Lila's small hands were clasped in prayer, though her lips trembled as if she wanted to scream. Outside, lightning struck, and for a moment, the flickering light revealed something behind the altar. A door, carved into the wall, covered in spirals, identical to the one that would be uncovered a century later. Elijah turned toward it. "The hollow must open again," he murmured, "and the blood must call to the blood." He gestured for the girls to come forward. Back in the present day, Sarah's cousin, Rebecca Vancroft, sat inside the local library, surrounded by old church records. The paper smelled of mold and age. She'd been tracing the family name, trying to understand why the spiral in the cellar reacted to Sarah's presence. One document caught her eye. A local paper from March 23, 1898. Elijah Vancroft and congregation missing after storm. Church burned. Suspected lightning strike. But there was a second clipping attached, never filed publicly. Handwritten in shaky ink. They burned the church, but not what lived beneath it. Rebecca's blood ran cold. She turned the paper over. Someone had drawn the spiral again, in red pencil, and beneath it a single line. "The blood sermon shall rise when can trespass." Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. A voicemail. She played it, and froze. It was Sarah's voice, but Sarah had vanished 2 weeks ago. "Becca, it's still here. Don't come back to the house. It knows your name." The message ended with static, then a faint whisper. She rewound it, played it again. The same voice, but this time another overlapped, deeper, older, in perfect unison. The sermon begins again. Back in 1898, lightning struck again. The door behind the altar creaked open, and the smell of rot poured out. The congregation gasped, some falling to their knees. Elijah raised his hands. He returns to us. The hollow awakens. Eleanor trembled as the jar in her hands began to shake. The black liquid inside boiling, bubbling. Grace dropped her lock of hair. It caught fire before it hit the floor. And Lila, the youngest, whispered through tears, "Papa, please don't make us do this." Elijah didn't answer. He began to speak in tongues, words twisting, echoing off the walls. The congregation followed, their voices blending into a rising, discordant hum that shook the boards beneath their feet. The spiral in the door began to spin. Wind poured into the chapel, though no window was open. And from the darkness behind the altar, a figure began to crawl out, human, but not entirely. Its body shimmered as though made of smoke and sinew, its eyes two pits of liquid silver. The air turned heavy, suffocating. Elijah fell to his knees. "The hollow spirit, we give you flesh." The girl screamed, and the candles went out. The next morning, only ashes remained. The church had burned down completely. The sheriff's report said the Vancroft family was never found. But under the ruins, there was one thing untouched by flame. A spiral carved into stone, still warm, faintly glowing. The report ended with a single handwritten line, probably from the sheriff himself. Whatever they called from below didn't burn. Back in the present, Rebecca slammed the old record shut. Her heart pounded as she whispered to herself, it wasn't a sermon. It was a summoning. And just then, every light in the library flickered out. The security camera blinked. And through the grainy black and white feed, she saw movement, something crawling down the hallway, dripping dark liquid across the floor. She didn't wait to look twice. Rebecca grabbed her things and ran out into the night. As the door swung closed behind her, the monitor showed a final image, the library floor from above. Rows of books, tables, and chairs, and in the middle of the aisle, a spiral. Formed out of blood, rain poured over the Ozarks like it had been waiting 100 years to return. Rebecca's car crawled through the mud-caked road, tires sliding, windshield wipers squealing against the storm. She had promised herself she wouldn't come back to the old Vancroft property, not after the message from Sarah. But curiosity and blood are powerful poisons. The GPS had stopped working miles ago. The map showed nothing but endless green. No road, no markings, just forest. But the car kept moving, guided by a strange rhythmic pulse in her chest that felt almost like memory. Lightning illuminated the ridge ahead, and there it was. The Vancroft house. It sat like a carcass at the edge of the hill, the wood swollen and blackened from years of rain and neglect. One shutter hung loose, creaking with the wind. But even through the fog, she could see the faint orange glow from one of the cellar windows. Someone, or something, was already inside. Rebecca stepped out into the mud. The storm bit through her coat, wind hissing through the trees. She froze when she saw the yard. The soil was disturbed, dug up in long, shallow trenches. Fresh earth. Like graves, she whispered to herself, trembling. Who's buried here? But deep down, she already knew. Inside, the house was worse than she remembered. Wallpaper peeled in long, curling sheets, exposing the ribs of rotted timber beneath. A single oil lamp flickered on a table in the parlor, half-burned, still warm. Rebecca's voice trembled. "Sarah?" Only silence answered. She moved deeper into the house, her footsteps echoing through the hall. Every picture frame was covered in dust, but one had been wiped clean. It was a family portrait, Elijah Vancroft standing behind his wife and 3 daughters. Someone had scratched out his face with something sharp and carved a single word beneath it. Returned. Rebecca's breath caught. The scratching was fresh. She descended the cellar steps, each creak of the wood echoing through the dark. The air grew colder, thicker. Her flashlight beam swept across the familiar spiral carved into the floor. Only this time, it wasn't dormant. The spiral glowed faintly red, pulsing like a heartbeat, just as Sarah had described. And above it hung an old photograph, pinned to the beam with a rusted nail. Rebecca stepped closer. The image was faded, but she could make out 3 girls standing in front of the chapel, the Vancroft Sisters. Behind them, a shadow. It wasn't Elijah. It was taller, and its hands reached around their shoulders like smoke. As she stared, the photograph began to change. The girl's eyes flickered, shifting, now staring directly at her. Her flashlight flickered. The bulb hissed, then died. Darkness swallowed her whole. From the shadows came a voice. Soft. Childlike. "You shouldn't have come, Becca." Her breath hitched. "Sarah, you always had to find the truth, just like them." The sound of bare feet on concrete echoed around her. A small hand brushed her arm, cold, wet. Then another. And another. They circled her. Whispering. Laughing. Rebecca screamed, swinging the flashlight wildly until it flickered back to life. But the cellar was empty. Only the spiral glowed, brighter now, and written beside it in something dark and wet were the words, "Blood remembers." She stumbled backward, tripping over a loose floorboard, and something rolled into the light. A locket. When she opened it, there was a photo of her as a child, inside the same house, but her family had never brought her here. At least, not that she remembered. Suddenly, she heard a low groan from behind the cellar wall, a muffled cry like someone trapped beneath the floor. Rebecca pressed her ear to the wood. "Sarah? Is that you?" A voice, raspy, desperate. "Don't let it in." The floorboards began to shake. A thin line of black liquid seeped through the cracks, crawling toward the spiral. Rebecca backed away, but the liquid formed words as it spread. "The blood sermon has begun." The spiral pulsed, casting the cellar in red light. And then, from the wall, a hand burst through, pale, rotted, clawed. It reached for her ankle and pulled. Rebecca screamed as the floor gave way beneath her, falling through black air, surrounded by whispers that seemed to come from inside her skull. When she hit the ground, the world was wrong. She was in the same cellar, but not as she knew it. The air was thick with the smell of burnt tallow and iron. Candles lined the walls, and the spiral on the floor burned like molten metal. A figure stood within it, tall, thin, wearing a preacher's coat blackened by soot. Elijah Vancroft turned slowly, his hollow eyes glinting red in the dark. "My daughter returns," he rasped. "The sermon continues through you." Rebecca trembled. "I'm not your..." But before she could finish, his hand reached out, not to touch her, but to command her blood. She felt her veins tighten, her heart seize. The spiral brightened, matching her pulse. "You are all mine, flesh of my faith, blood of my vow." The candles flared, and Rebecca screamed as her shadow split from her body, twisting, contorting, taking on a shape of its own. When it looked up, it smiled. Her smile. Above ground, the storm stopped. The house stood still. Lightning illuminated the cellar window one last time. Two shadows now moved inside, where one had entered. And when the wind carried the first hymn from the ruins, it wasn't sung by human throats. The blood sermon had found its next preacher. The old chapel at the edge of Vancroft Hollow hadn't been opened in nearly 40 years. Its wooden doors were swollen from decades of rain. Its bell tower leaned like a drunk watching the road. The air smelled of mold, wax, and something faintly metallic, like dried blood forgotten in the floorboards. The entire town whispered that the last time the chapel's bell rang was the night Reverend Elias Vancroft disappeared. That night, his daughters, Esther and Miriam, were seen dragging something heavy into the woods behind the cemetery. No one dared to follow. Now, in 1938, the chapel was being opened again. A storm rolled across the Ozark Ridge as a group of curious locals pushed through the doors. Sheriff Lowell, pale and trembling, led the way with a lantern. He was an old man now, but his eyes still carried the ghost of that night 40 years ago. Inside, dust hung thick as fog. The pews were warped and split. Every window was stained with mildew. At the altar stood a cracked portrait of Reverend Elias, his eyes too lifelike, too wet, as though he were still watching from beyond the paint. As the sheriff stepped closer, something under the altar creaked. He knelt, pushing the lantern closer. Beneath a loose floorboard was a stack of journals bound with black ribbon. The pages were brittle, but the ink had hardly faded. The words inside were not prayers, they were confessions. The Reverend had written of the hollow hunger beneath the house, of the daughters chosen by the dark, of the voice that came from the well, and then one passage that froze Lowell's blood. "When the bloodline weakens, the church must feed again. My children are its vessels. The sermon will never end." A thunderclap shook the chapel. The lantern flickered. Someone gasped. The portrait of Elias had changed. His mouth, once a straight painted line, now curved into a grin. The doors slammed shut. The wind rose like a chorus of screaming voices. Every candle in the chapel lit at once, bright, furious, unnatural. The pews rattled. The bell above began to ring. Though no rope was pulled, Lowell shouted for everyone to get out. But the floor split open. From the chasm crawled two pale shapes, hair dripping wet, dresses rotten, eyes black as river stones. Esther and Miriam Vancroft had returned. Their faces were the same as in the old photographs. Beautiful, cold, dead. Their hands left streaks of red on the floor as they crawled toward the altar. "Father," Esther whispered, her voice trembling like a lullaby. "We heard your sermon." Miriam lifted her face to the portrait. "We are ready to serve again." The bell tolled once more, deafening this time. The glass windows shattered inward. Lightning struck the cross above the chapel, and for one terrible moment, Everything glowed white. When the storm passed, the chapel was gone. All that remained was the bell, cracked clean in half, and a trail of wet footprints leading back into the woods. Weeks later, children playing near the river found a new well, where none had existed before. Carved into the stone rim were fresh words, "The sermon continues," and deep within, echoing from the dark, came the faintest sound of a woman humming an old hymn. The year was 1941. By then, the story of the Vancroft Chapel's disappearance had twisted itself into local folklore, part ghost tale, part warning. People whispered that if you walked too close to the river at night, you could still hear Esther Vancroft's lullaby floating through the trees. But nobody really believed it, not until the children vanished. It started with Samuel Harlan, a boy of 9, last seen near the new well that had appeared by the riverbank. He'd been chasing frogs with his sister Clara when he stopped to listen to something, a faint humming, almost like a mother's song. Clara ran home screaming an hour later. She said Samuel had leaned over the stone rim, smiling, and said, "Mama's calling from down there." Then he slipped, as if someone had pulled him by the hands. The splash never came. The town formed a search party. They dropped ropes, torches, even dynamite into the well, but it was impossibly deep. The echoes came back wrong, like the earth itself was swallowing their voices. Sheriff Lowell, older and slower now, arrived to see for himself. When he shone his light into the shaft, he froze. The well wasn't wet, it was breathing. The air pulsed upward in slow, damp sighs, carrying the smell of rot and lilies. A local pastor, Reverend Jonah Pike, declared the site demon-touched. He built a wooden cross beside the well and held sermons there every Sunday, praying to keep whatever was inside from rising again. But every time he preached, he could hear humming beneath his words. Soft, feminine, harmonizing with his prayers. By midsummer, the well had a name whispered among the locals, the Singing Well. They said if you listened long enough, it would sing your name too. Then, the livestock began dying. Horses were found with their throats slit, their eyes missing. Sheep wandered in circles until they collapsed. Each morning, the soil around the well grew darker, damp with something that wasn't water. The sheriff's deputy suggested sealing it with concrete. But that night, the men who tried, 5 of them, were never seen again. Their tools were found near the riverbank, along with muddy, barefoot prints leading back to the woods. 2 pairs of prints. One larger, one smaller. Both female. The townspeople panicked. Many fled, but Reverend Pike refused to leave. "God's work is not finished," he told the frightened crowd. "This place will be purified." On the eve of the summer solstice, he gathered his remaining congregation and led them to the well for one final sermon. He opened his Bible and stopped. The pages were blank. Every verse had vanished, replaced by damp stains and the faint outline of lips pressed into the paper. The ground began to tremble. A sweet, sickly perfume filled the air. From the well rose a voice, not a scream, not a moan, but a lullaby. The same one Clara Harlan remembered. It was followed by another voice. Deeper, male, Reverend Elias Vancroft. "My daughters sing well, don't they, Jonah?" The sermon was never yours to end. The well burst open. Black water gushed upward, swallowing the crowd. For hours afterward, witnesses in nearby farms saw a pale light glowing over the river, flickering like a lantern beneath the water. By dawn, the singing well had vanished. In its place was a sinkhole, silent and cold. Reverend Pike and his flock were gone. The cross he had built lay snapped in half, soaked in something too red to be mud. But some nights, when the wind carried across the Ozarks, people still swore they could hear 2 women singing softly in the dark, their song echoing through the trees like a promise. The bloodline sleeps, but the sermon lives. The winter of 1942 came early to Millstone. The river froze before Thanksgiving, and the air carried a smell no one could quite place. Sweet like honeysuckle, but faintly metallic as if the snow itself had veins. No one mentioned the singing well anymore. The state had declared the Vancroft property condemned, and the hollow was fenced off. But the fence didn't stop the voices. At night, travelers passing through said they heard women whispering from the trees, sometimes laughing, sometimes weeping. The voices always stopped when the listener turned their head. And then the dreams began. It started with Margaret Cleary, a widowed schoolteacher who had recently moved into a boarding house near the river. She told her landlord that every night she saw 2 young women standing at the foot of her bed, their hair wet, their eyes dark and bottomless. They didn't speak, but they hummed a lullaby that seemed to echo inside her ribs. She'd wake drenched in sweat, her sheets damp, as if she'd been pulled from a river. Her landlord found her one morning standing in her backyard barefoot, her nightgown frozen stiff, staring at the tree line. When asked what she was doing, she whispered, "They're almost home." That same week, the town's preacher, Reverend Collins, disappeared after his Sunday sermon. His congregation found his Bible open at the pulpit, its pages soaked through with river water. On the inside of the cover, someone had written in smeared ink, "You cannot bury what was born from sin." Sheriff Lowell, now in his 70s, was brought out of retirement when more townsfolk started vanishing. He didn't want the job. He'd seen what happened in the hollow, and it had haunted him for 40 years. But when he found a trail of wet footprints leading from the frozen river to the back door of the boarding house, he knew the curse had spread. The prints stopped at Margaret Cleary's room. Inside, her bed was empty, but the pillow was soaked, as if someone had cried on it all night. Pinned to her wall with a rusted nail was a photograph. Old, torn, faded. It showed two young women in 19th century dresses, their faces half-shadowed. At the bottom, barely legible, was a handwritten name, E. and R. Vancroft. Sheriff Lowell's blood ran cold. He packed up what little courage he had left and rode out toward the condemned Vancroft Hollow. The snow was knee-deep, the wind carrying whispers that seemed to form words. "Father, Father." He followed them. The Vancroft farmhouse was gone, burned down decades ago, but the cellar door still stood, half buried in frost. It was ajar. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and something older. Something alive. The lantern flickered as he stepped in. Beneath the dirt floor, faintly, came the sound of water dripping, and then, unmistakably, the sound of breathing. Slow, rhythmic, like a heart buried beneath the ground. Lowell whispered, "Esther, Ruth." The cellar replied, "Father." The floorboards split open. A hand, pale, water-swollen, burst from the dirt and clutched his ankle. Another reached for his throat. The sheriff screamed as the lantern fell, fire racing across the floor. The cellar filled with smoke, with singing, with the smell of burning lilies. The next morning, locals found only his badge, half melted, lying beside the cellar ruins. And next to it, a set of two muddy footprints leading toward Millstone. That night, Margaret Cleary returned. Her eyes were black, her voice calm. She walked through town humming the same lullaby the others had heard in their dreams. By dawn, the river had thawed. The water ran red for miles. The thawed river looked alive. Thick fog rolled over its surface, curling through the reeds like fingers. By spring, Millstone's fishermen refused to go near it. Their nets came back heavy, not with trout, but with small bones polished smooth by the current. The Vancroft curse was no longer a rumor. It was a pulse running beneath the town. The water calls. At dawn, Margaret Cleary stood at the bank in her white dress, the same one she'd been buried in 2 months before. The townsfolk watched her step into the current without sinking, her reflection rippling into two faces. From the bridge, a child whispered, "The river wants a bride." The next morning, 4 more women vanished. Their houses were found open, doors unlatched, windows steaming with condensation. Inside each bedroom, a pool of water gleamed on the floor, shaped like 2 sets of footprints facing one another. 2 whispers in the wells. Reverend Collins' church bell rang by itself at midnight. When the men climbed the tower, they found the ropes soaked and the brass etched with words no one could translate, letters like vines curling into each other. The town clerk compared them to old Ozark spell sigils used for binding and returning. He didn't sleep again. By the 3rd night, the wells began to hum. People said the sound matched the tune of that lullaby, slow, circular, endless. Every woman who heard it began to dream of the same place. A cellar filled with rushing water and 2 sisters waiting with open arms. 3. The procession. The sheriff organized a search party. They never made it past the bridge. The fog thickened until lantern light turned black, and the river started to glow from beneath. Soft, golden, hypnotic. Through it, shapes moved. Women in bridal veils of weeds and lilies, hair drifting like ink. At their center, 2 figures walked hand in hand. Esther and Ruth Vancroft, faces calm, eyes lit with that same underwater gleam. When the men returned at sunrise, only one spoke. He said the sisters had built a church below the current. He said they were marrying the river. Then his lungs filled with water as he tried to finish his sentence. For the flood, rain came for 7 straight days. The river swelled and burst its banks, crawling through the streets of Millstone like a living thing. From every flooded window came singing. People boarded up their homes, but the water rose higher, pounding like fists against the wood. Beneath the roar of the storm was a voice, a woman's, low and pleading, "Bring him home to us." When the clouds broke, the entire lower town was gone. Where streets had been, there was only the slow swirl of muddy water and the glimmer of pale faces drifting just below the surface. 5. The last witness, atop the hill, inside the old courthouse, a single survivor wrote everything he saw. His name was Daniel Price, a journalist from St. Louis. He had come to Millstone chasing folklore. He left with a story no editor would print. He wrote of seeing the river part like a curtain, revealing steps leading down. He wrote that the sisters were waiting, smiling, each holding a bridal crown of bone. He wrote that they whispered one name, his own, and that he ran until dawn. When rescuers found his body, the pages were soaked through, the ink blurred, but every sheet carried the faint smell of river lilies. Perfect. Here's the final cinematic chapter. The haunting conclusion that ties everything back to your channel's name, Forgotten Remains. It stays historical, eerie, and supernatural, the curse's last echo beneath the Missouri Ozarks. The reservoir didn't exist in 1898. It was built 40 years later when the state decided to flood Millstone Valley for hydroelectric power. No one spoke of the town that lay beneath it. They said it was cheaper to drown ghosts than to explain them. But in the fall of 1983, the drought came. The water level dropped 30 feet, and for the first time in decades, the roof of an old church rose from the surface like a broken tooth. Reporters came. So did archaeologists, thrill-seekers, and believers. Among them was a young documentarian named Ellen Ward, producing a series for a small TV channel called Forgotten Remains. She heard the legends, how the Vancroft Sisters' spirits haunted the water, how entire families vanished, how the river itself was said to sing. But she didn't believe in curses. Not until she stepped inside that church. The chapel beneath the water. The air inside the church was heavy with silt and silence. Every pew was covered in a thin crust of mud. Fish bones glittered between the hymn books. At the altar, a cracked mural showed two veiled women holding a crown between them. Beneath their feet, painted in faded red, were the words, "The river remembers what the earth forgets." Ellen raised her flashlight toward the pulpit and froze. A camera lay there, old, rusted, covered in barnacles. Inside was a strip of black film, perfectly preserved in its case. The film. Back in her studio, Ellen had the film cleaned and restored. It was nitrate, dated 1931. No one could explain how it survived underwater for half a century. When the footage played, the screen flickered to life with scenes of the old town before it was flooded, children running, farmers waving, Sunday bells ringing. Then the camera shifted, descending into the riverbed, into the cellar of a house. There, two women stood in front of a mirror, holding hands. At first, they looked alive. But as the light flickered, their faces dissolved, water spilling from their eyes like tears, their mouths open as if gasping for breath. Behind them, a man was kneeling. Bound. Silent. Ellen paused the film, heart pounding. On the wall behind him were fresh carvings. He is home. The screen went black. Then came a final frame, a close-up of the two sisters' faces. They were smiling directly at the camera, and between them stood a third figure. It was Ellen. The return? That night, Ellen left her editing room unlocked. The janitor found the film still playing, no one in the room, only a puddle spreading across the floor. The police searched for her for weeks. They found her car abandoned near the reservoir's edge, headlights still on, driver's door open. Divers recovered her camera 2 months later. The footage was intact. It showed her walking toward the drained basin, whispering to someone unseen. Then she turned, faced the lens, and said, "They remember me." The screen filled with water, and the tape ended. For legacy. Today, locals say the reservoir still sings when the wind is right. They say if you listen long enough, you'll hear voices beneath the waves. Two women humming, another answering softly. Ellen's documentary was never released, but every year on the anniversary of her disappearance, a single VHS tape arrives in the mailrooms of random small TV stations across the Midwest. The label always says the same thing, Forgotten Remains. Episode 1. The water ripples. Two shadows drift beneath the surface, holding hands. Then a voice. Ellen's faint, almost kind. Some stories don't end. They sink.